Hello, I'm Tamara Copeland, President of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, an organization that we affectionately call WRAG. We support the philanthropic sector in Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland, and in the District of Columbia. In 2016, we embarked upon a learning journey to explore the depth and breadth and impact of structural racism and implicit bias. We called it Putting Racism on the Table. 2 years later, we asked our members if this learning journey had made a difference. We were pleased when they reported that 36% are now doing their grant making using a racial equity lens, and an additional 34% is considering that strategy. And while we know that philanthropy can definitely be catalytic, we also know that philanthropy alone will not make this a racially equitable region. So we have partnered with Leadership Greater Washington to expand the table for racial equity. We are joining with nonprofit leaders and with business leaders to again look at issues around structural racism and implicit bias. We are delighted that you are a part of this learning journey. Next, Dr. Ibram Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning, will explore the topic of structural racism.
I want to sort of talk to you very briefly about Stamped from the Beginning, and specifically what my findings from researching and producing this book led me to realize about the maintenance of structural racism, which of course is the focus of my talk sort of more broadly. And so this book was a history of racist ideas, literally spanning its entire story, from its origins in 15th century Portugal to today. And so in simply wanting to write a history of racist ideas, I first had to do something that's actually quite controversial, and it's always been very controversial, and that is define a racist idea. And I say that's controversial because, of course, we're living in a time that's no different than 1776 or 1850 or 1915 or 1619, when enslaved Africans first arrived on these shores. And what I mean by that is that no matter what people say, no matter what ideas they express, they simultaneously say those ideas are not racist. Anybody know what I'm talking about? No matter what they say, no matter how vulgar, no matter how degrading, no matter how false, the next response is, I am not a racist, and thereby that idea is not a racist. Anybody know what I'm talking about? I don't have to give any examples, do I? I don't think so, right? We're all living in Washington, D.C., right? And so I first and most importantly had to do something very simple, and that is define a racist idea. And I say, again, it was simple, but then again, it was extremely complex, because every group of racist ideas, every group of people who expressed these racist ideas that I chronicle and stamp from the beginning, from people who were enslaving people by the millions, to people who were establishing and maintaining Jim Crow, to people now who are mass incarcerating or mass disenfranchising. Each and every one of these ideas that they were using, that they were employing, they typically were defining outside of racism. They were saying that this policy, that idea is God's law. That idea is nature's law. That idea can be substantiated by science, by the science of statistics. That idea is obvious. It's logical. I remember one of the most crazy examples, I mean, crazy probably isn't the best term, is, I don't know if any of you remember during the Reagan administration, there was this Reagan aide who did a pretty sizable study on families. And more specifically, in the study, he analyzed the black family. And by then, it had become quite popular over the course of 20 years that to say that the black family was broken, that single black mothers who were heading many of these families were rendering them pathological. And it was also quite popular, particularly in the 80s and ultimately into the early 90s, to say that the reason why these women are unmarried with apparently a lot of kids is because they're trying to have more babies so they can get more, anybody remember? Welfare. So in his study, which he classified as scientific, he stated, and I'm sort of paraphrasing him, direct quotes in the book, that we don't have any evidence to prove that these women are having more babies to get more welfare, but obviously, if you look at the situation, that is true. And so, it's just one example of many that simply defining a racist idea is actually was a lot more difficult than I originally thought. And so I ended up defining a racist idea very simply. And I say simply because, to me, the work of the scholar is to clarify the complexities, so everyday people can understand that definition and therefore apply it to first and foremost, their own ideas, but then also be able to apply it to the ideas of others. And I defined it as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And the contrast with a racist idea was an anti-racist idea. So in Stand From the Beginning, I chronicle this long debate between racist and anti-racist ideas. I know in our time, we're taught that the contrast, that the dialectic is between racist and non-racist ideas. But in reality, there's no such thing as not racist ideas. There's only racist and anti-racist ideas. And so if racist ideas suggest racial hierarchy, then anti-racist ideas simply suggest racial equality. Anti-racist ideas suggest that the racial groups are equal. And that doesn't mean that they're the same, nor does it mean that there are no lazy or criminally minded or violent black people. But it means that no one has ever definitively proven that there are more lazy, criminally minded, violent black people than there are white people. They've used statistics that mislead us into believing that's the case, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but no one has ever definitively proven. And so what makes the racial groups equal is not the greatness of black people who we're celebrating this month. We're going to be celebrating a lot of great black individuals. Or what actually makes the racial groups equal is their imperfections. Is the imperfections of all of these different racial groups. In other words, racial groups, just like groups, are a collection of imperfect individuals. And so I don't necessarily need to see every black person acting in an upstanding manner for me to think or know that black people are just as equal to other racial groups. And so I say that because in writing a history of racist ideas, I simultaneously had to, in many ways, write a history of racist policies, which together constitute structural racism. And so clearly, as a scholar, I try not to write anything that I haven't defined. And so I ended up defining racist policies, and actually I'm working on a book specifically geared towards the history of racist policies that can sort of serve as a complement to Stand From the Beginning. But in defining a racist policy, I defined it as any policy that yields a racial inequity. Now, that's very different than the way it has specifically been defined throughout American history, but more critically, the way in which the courts have interpreted civil rights legislation. And I say that because typically when people think of a racist policy, the first and most important thing they think of is intent. Anybody know what I'm talking about? So really, the way our society, the way our courts, the way our leaders, even the way our people define a racist policy is this intent to discriminate against a particular racial group. And so those who want to consciously discriminate against a particular racial group, over the last 50 years, since the passage of the Civil Rights and even Voting Rights Act, they have decided to very simply make sure that you and I can't prove what? Intent. It's a very easy thing to do, right? So I'm going to consciously discriminate against these people, and that's going to be my intention. But when I write the actual policy, the measure, I'm actually going to ensure that there are no racial language in the measures. And I'm going to make sure they can't find any emails in which I talked about this. And because they won't be able to do that, to see that, then nobody can prove intent, and therefore nobody can prove this policy, which is yielding my company, my town, my organization to have a disproportionate number of black people or a disproportionate number of people in positions of leadership or a disproportionate amount of black poverty. I can say that those racial inequities are not the result of my policies, because you can't prove intent. And so either as a society, we use the very definition that those who are seeking to discriminate have yielded for us, or we issue a different definition, a definition that they cannot get around the fact that they are actually discriminating. And so that's why I defined it as yields an unequal, a racially unequal outcome, or yields a racial inequity. Because you can hide intent, and discriminators have been doing it quite effectively over the last 50 years. We've seen the way in which that has happened most recently with a series of voter suppression techniques all over the country, in which there was no racial language in any of these policies. And then that yielded some courts to say, like a courageous court in North Carolina, that this policy is targeting African American voters with surgical precision, a policy that said nothing about race. In the same way the grandfather clauses said nothing about race, poll taxes said nothing about race. Jim Crow policies that people understand as racist policies didn't say anything about race, which we consider to be racist policies now because the unequal outcome they yielded. And so they can't hide that unequal outcome. It's impossible. What they're trying to do, though, is imagine a nation that is post-racial, or imagine this idea that we are all one race, which scientifically that is absolutely the case. Geneticists have shown over the last 20 years that the racialized groups writ large are 99% genetically the same. They've also proven that there's more genetic diversity within Africa than between Africa and other parts of the world. They've also proven that Western Africans are more genetically similar to Western Europeans than they are to Eastern Africans. So it's absolutely the case that race as a scientific or biological concept does not exist. But when you start saying we are all one race, or you start imagining that we're a post-racial society, what you end up beginning to do is refusing to categorize by race. And then when you refuse to categorize by race, you cannot see racial inequity. And so that is the whole reason behind the post-racial plan. So we're not categorizing by race, and so therefore we can't see racial inequity, and so then we can't even see the outcomes of their racist policies. So really, when you think about racism as a construct, you're really thinking about the marriage of racist policies and racist ideas. That really racist policies and racist ideas constitute racism. The interplay between racist ideas and racist policies. The marriage, the way they interact, the way they're literally in love and have been so for for nearly 600 years. And I just want to sort of give you a sense historically about the way racist ideas and racist policies have interacted. And again, the way in which these ideas were critical in supporting racist policies, which as a collection constitute structural racism. When we think about slavery, and I don't necessarily have to give a history of slavery, but when we think about slavery, which lasted in this country upwards of almost 250 years, how was it able to last that long? And how were those policies that yielded black slavery and white freedom, how are they able to sustain themselves? How are those policies able to sustain themselves? Policies that made it legal for people to trade families, to break up families, made it legal for planters to whip their enslaved captives into submission to ensure the violence that literally sustained slavery. How did it make it legal for them to execute their captives? How did it make it legal for this group of planters in the South to become the richest group of people in the world by the time of the Civil War? Now, I know a lot of people like to imagine that slavery was not profitable, that slavery is some sort of is outside of the development of American capitalism. But recent research has demonstrated that you cannot understand the making of American capitalism. You cannot understand the making of the American nation and America's riches without understanding the development and the making of slavery and the way in which slave owners, like factory workers in the North, were able to figure out ways to continuously ensure that their captives were turning out more than they were last year, in the way in which they were doing that. And so how are they able to sustain this? How are they able to sustain this? How are they able to sustain these racist policies? Why is it that so many Americans, even up until the time of the Civil War, were either neutral about slavery or for it? I like to tell my students, and they're shocked, that in 1864, during the Civil War, you had, of course, Abraham Lincoln running for re-election. And his opponent in the Democratic Party ran on a platform that would have reunited the North with the South and reestablished slavery. By 1864, of course, Abraham Lincoln had already issued the Emancipation Proclamation, opening the door for captives to literally run away from their plantation to the lines of freedom. And of course, many captives were doing that. They were also running into the Union Army. ultimately allowing the Union Army to assemble a critical group of 200,000 soldiers that military historians have made the case turned the tide of the Civil War, because many Northern Americans who were not against slavery were like, why are you making me go and risk my life to end slavery? And so in 1864, this Democratic Party ran this pro-slavery candidate who in the Union, not in the Confederate States, which had succeeded, but in the Union received 45% of the vote. 45% of the vote. And so, we like to think, right, by the time of the Civil War, that the vast majority of Americans was against slavery. That even Abraham Lincoln himself issued the Emancipation Proclamation because he was an abolitionist. Even though abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison were constantly criticizing him for his lack of abolitionism. But, so how was it that so many Americans were looking the other way or were for slavery in the way so many Americans today have been looking the other way or for mass incarceration? It's very simply racist ideas. Racist ideas. So these slave owners, to substantiate their policies, made the case that black people were the cursed descendants of Ham. That because of what Ham did, for those of you who have read your Bible recently, for those of you who know the story of Noah and his sons, that Ham looked at his father and all of his drunkenness, and that caused Noah to curse the descendants of Ham into perpetual slavery and blackness. That blackness is a curse. That Southerners, pro-slavery theologians in particular, were making the case that this is God's law. We, as slave owners, are carrying out God's law. Or for those who were not Christian, they were believing the leading American scholars on race in the 1850s. Scholars who were imagining that every race was literally a different species, and that each species had its own creation story. And those who believed this theory and pushed this scientific theory, those who were Christian, made the case that the Garden of Eden was in Europe, and Europeans are the descendants, as in a species, of the white Adam and Eve, while those who were, and they also made the case that black people were created alongside animals in Africa. And so they were making this case known as polygenesis, multiple sort of origins. And people like Samuel Morton, who was a UPenn professor, or people like Louis Agassiz, who founded the Harvard Scientific School, or people like, there were so many leading polygenicists that in the United States that European scholars were calling this theory of polygenesis the American School of Ethnology. That's how popular it was. And that caused people like Charles Darwin, who wrote a book called The Origins of Species in 1859, to make the case that no, polygenesis is wrong. And so if you read the opening pages of The Origins of Species, he's challenging polygenesis theory, saying that no, the way to understand the origins of species is it's a single species that has evolved over time. And then that caused those who wanted to continuously make a case for black inferiority and white superiority, and specifically make a case for those policies that created, as scholars call it, slavery by another name, after the end of the Civil War, and specifically after the fall of Reconstruction. They made the case for their policies that kept black labor cheap by saying that white people have evolved far more than black people. That white people are headed towards perfection, while black people are headed towards extinction. Because, of course, Darwin's theory made the case that all species, all groups of beings, are either evolving towards perfection because they're being naturally selected, or they're devolving towards extinction. And that's how we understand why certain species have grown and expanded across the world. And when I say species, I'm not only talking about humans, but even animals, while others are extinct because they're naturally inferior. And so that, of course, notions of social Darwinism became critical in justifying Jim Crow, in justifying the policies and the structural racism, form of structural racism that persisted. Ideas like, you know what, yes, it is the case that there are no more black politicians in the South. By 1901, from 1901 to roughly the 1920s, there was not a single black congressman in Washington, D.C. That black politicians were rare in the South. Black voters were even more rare. And they were making the case, well, why would you want a group of people who are headed towards extinction, who clearly are inferior, to be ruling over a naturally selected people? That's the case that they made. And of course, so social Darwinism also generated a movement called Eugenics, a movement that, from a policy standpoint, stated, I mean, it makes sense that if you have fit, superior people genetically, and you have unfit, inferior peoples who are ruining society, that we should encourage the reproduction of those fit, superior peoples and discourage the reproduction of those inferior peoples. I mean, it makes complete sense that people would make that case and that they would push for policies that made that case. And of course, the more radical one stated that not only should we be encouraging or discouraging, we should be, in the case of the US South, sterilizing black women by the tens of thousands, or in the case of Nazi Germany, murdering people by the millions, murdering unfit people by the millions. And so these policies, of course, these eugenic policies, by the time of the, sort of in reaction to the Nazi Holocaust, were, of course, challenged across the world and finally identified as racist policies. And the eugenic ideas that were behind them were finally identified as racist ideas. And so, of course, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was a movement against eugenics, a movement against notions of that we were all created unequal and that those inferior people should be killed or incarcerated. But the policies, or I should say the inequities between the racial groups persisted. And so by the 60s, they couldn't explain them by saying that a particular racial group was genetically inferior. So they changed course. They changed course to understand why black people were inferior. And that new course became environment. So they were not inferior by nature. They were inferior by nurture. And I talk about nature versus nurture because nature versus nurture has long been the debate between racist ideas, between some who have made the case that black people are inferior by nature and therefore permanently inferior. And I call this group, and stand from the beginning, segregationist. And then those who believe that black people are inferior by nurture, and they're temporarily inferior. And so we have the capacity to civilize and develop them. And I call this group of people in the book assimilationist. So really, stand from the beginning is this long debate between segregationist, assimilationist, and anti-racist ideas. People who are like, black people are neither inferior by nature nor nurture. That black people are not just created equal, they are equal. And does everybody understand that? The difference between created equal and are equal. I just want you to sit with that for a second while my voice clears up a little bit. And so by the 60s, instead of saying that black people were genetically inferior and that justified the inequities, and that justified us not looking for the racist policies, not seeing the structural racism, it changed to environment. It changed to this idea that African American culture was pathological, was a derivation of American culture, and that this inferior culture were breeding these inferior peoples. And at the heart and center of this inferior culture was the black family. And this black family was the sort of engine and source of not just sort of a, quote, bad situation for these children, but literally these single parent families were raising children to become criminals, or raising women to become baby makers. And that it did not matter, even if we created equal opportunity for these inferior people, that they would not be able to take advantage of them because of their inferior upbringing, their inferior environment. And so, as a result, instead of us turning to focus on structural racism, Americans began turning to focus on developing the black family, developing African American culture, figuring out ways to tutor and mentor and civilize these mass groups of people that were inferior. And as an aside, the assumption that there was a greater number of single parent households, and the data that showed that there was a growing number of single parent households that typically headed by women, that was the result of black men and women not being able to get along, or that was the result of some sort of black immorality, or that was the result of something wrong about these people. Like they wanted to stay single so they could get more babies. Or the black men were not responsible in taking care of their kids. That actually was statistically and has proven to itself to be not true. And the reason for the growing number of female-headed black households over the course of the 20th century was not because single black women were having more kids. It was because married black women were having less kids. Everybody understand that? So you have a growing percentage of black children being born into single parent households. There's only one or two causes. Either single people having more kids or married people having less. And a lot of this sort of picked up in the 70s. And what was happening in the 70s? Something called Black feminism, in which something called women, including Black women, heading into the workforce. And some of these women were like, I don't need to have 5 kids, like my own family. And I think in the 1910s, my great-great-grandmother, who was married, had, I think, 15 kids. My grandmother, in the 20s and 30s, had 6 kids. My mother, as well as 2 of her sisters, had 2 kids. These are all married women. Right, and I think if, many Black people think about their own families, so that they see that sort of similar trend. But of course, this was used to cloud us to the existence of structural racism, to cause us to think that the problem were these people as opposed to these policies. And so that was very critical in the justification for the policies that really began with the Johnson administration and climaxed in the Reagan and Clinton administrations, policies that led to the mass incarceration of Black people, policies that led to police officers being encouraged to be tough on criminals. And criminals in this country have always been colored Black, right? Because when Black people, like Frederick Douglass, who celebrates his 200th birthday tomorrow, would run away, that act would be considered illegal. He would fundamentally be called a fugitive, as he was during the early part of his speaking career, this fugitive from the law. And so when Black people would resist slavery, they were deemed criminals. When they would resist Jim Crow, they were deemed criminals. And those criminals were either incarcerated or sheriffs decided, you know what, they're not even going to incarcerate these people. I'm going to help gather up this mob. And this mob is going to lynch these people. And in our time, when the unemployment rate among young Black people in some cities is topping 50%, in some cities it's much higher than that. I saw a statistic that found that the average young Black male in Chicago makes $9,000 a year. And so you put these people in a situation in which they're making $9,000 a year, in which it's tough to find a good paying job. And then they turn to a better paying job that's illegal, selling, let's say, marijuana, which is less toxic to the body than alcohol. And then we throw them in prison and say they're the problem. Or when they establish their business, and I'm calling it a business because that's what they call it, right? And they, like any business person, have to compete and challenge and degrade their competition. And in many cases, that degradation of their competition yields violence. Or when a block is controlled by a particular drug dealer, and that drug dealer is arrested, there's a battle over who's going to gain control of that block. And that battle oftentimes is violence. And so one of the things that one study, it was very interesting, out of Seattle, found was that these researchers sort of studied how in black drug districts versus white drug districts, and these low-level drug dealers were constantly being mass incarcerated, which were leading to the destabilization of markets. And they contrasted that with white drug districts in which there was not a mass incarceration of the low-level drug dealers. And they found that mass incarceration of low-level drug dealers was actually causing violence. Could everybody see how that would work? And that they supposed that if those white drug dealers were constantly being arrested too, and there was a fight over the control of the market, in the way there's a fight over the control of the market in the Middle East, that it would yield violence. And so we also know that studies show there's a direct correlation between unemployment levels and violent crime levels in communities. That there's a direct correlation between poverty levels and violence levels in communities. But there's actually no correlation between blackness and violence. Now, some of you look at me like I'm crazy. If there was a correlation, a direct correlation, a direct causation between blackness and violence, then that means black communities, no matter their income level, would have the same levels of violence. Everybody understand that? They'd have the same level of violence. If it's the black people that are causing the violence, then black middle-income neighborhoods, black upper-income neighborhoods would have the same levels of violence as the black impoverished neighborhoods. Now, is that true? No, it's not true, and it's never been true. And it's actually the same case in the white community, that white upper-income neighborhoods have less violence than white impoverished neighborhoods. And so we see this correlation across racial groups. Higher levels of unemployment, higher levels of violence. But instead of us as a society saying, okay, you know what, so does that mean that it's better to fight crime with jobs than jails and police? No, we say the reason why there's so much violence in those, quote, black communities is because the black families are broken, is because there's a subculture of violence, is because they don't have any mentors, is because there's something wrong with the people. Thank you. She's like, get your voice together, boy. Thank you. That's much better. So we just assume that the people are the problem instead of the policies. And that then yields our decisions of public policy making, but it also yields what we decide as a leadership and philanthropic community to fund. If you believe that the problem is people and you want to solve the problem, then it makes complete sense that you're going to fund those organizations that are trying to solve those people. But if you recognize that the problem, the racial problem, is structural racism, is racist policies, then when you're thinking about eliminating the racial problem, you're going to focus on funding those organizations that are challenging structural racism, that are challenging racist policies. Now, I should say it's a lot more complex because historically, assimilationists that I mentioned earlier thought that actually it was both. Historically, assimilationists have recognized the existence of racial discrimination while also in racist policies and structural racism, while also thinking there was something wrong with the people. So abolitionists in particular thought that slavery was wrong and discrimination that was undergirding slavery was wrong, but they also thought that these enslaved Africans were barbaric because Africa was barbaric, or they thought that slavery was literally making black people inferior, that the dehumanizing environment of slavery, as it certainly was literally making these people subhuman. William Lloyd Garrison in particular, the foremost white male abolitionist, made the case that slavery is turning black people into brutes. And that's why it's so bad. And that's why, as Americans, we have to end it. Of course, slavery ended, and what I call the discrimination inferiority thesis only continued. It continued with segregation. That segregation, as horrible as it is, was literally making black people inferior. That this dehumanizing set of structurally racist policies was doing that. And I think one of the most obvious examples is, I think most people are familiar with the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Anybody heard of that decision? But most people, including myself, before researching STEM from the beginning, hasn't actually read the opinion. And the justification that Chief Justice Earl Warren gave for classifying segregated schools as unconstitutional. I assumed, and I'm sure many of you assume, that the court realized that the schools weren't equal, particularly from a resource standpoint. I mean, it was all sorts of data showing the amount of money going to the black schools or the amount of money states were providing for black children versus for white children. But in his opinion, Warren stated that I agree with the lower court that found that the schools are equal or being equalized. So, let me repeat that. That he stated that I agree with the lower court's opinion that the schools are equal or being equalized. No, when I first read that, I was like, oh, he's be equal or being equalized. So then, why did the court issue the Brown v. Board of Education decision? Well, since really the 30s, you know, like now it's pretty like popular to talk about and write about black people. In the 30s, it became more and more popular to talk about and write about black people. And you had a number of white scholars in particular who either started writing about black people or had been writing about black people for a while, like Robert Park, who was the dean of the Chicago School of Urban Sociology. And really, when you think about sociology and its relationship to race, he really pioneered it, or France Boas, who founded the Columbia School of Anthropology. And probably his most famous student was a woman by the name of Ruth Benedict, who I would consider, at least as it relates to the history of racism. He also was a teacher of somebody by the name of Zora Neale Hurston, who of course is one of the deans of Black women's literature. But in the case of Ruth Benedict, she wrote a book called Racism, Science, and Society in 1940. And she really popularized the term racism. And she defined racism as the unproven assumption of the biological and perpetual superiority of one group over another. And she defined it in that way because she had been writing, as Boas had been writing, about the temporary and cultural inferiority of Black people, which of course, in her definition, was not what? Racism. And so these scholars were trying to study, why is it that the Italians are becoming white, the Irish are becoming white, the Jews are becoming white? Why is it that these white ethnic groups that poured into the United States in large numbers, particularly before the 1924 Immigration Act, which pretty much barred or reduced the number of immigrants coming from every country that was not in Northeastern Europe. And that's sort of ironic because then their descendants now are trying to do the same thing. The descendants of people from Eastern and Southern Europe are trying to do the same thing and making the case in the same way. So those people who supported this racist immigration bill made the case that we have to keep America American, to quote the President of the United States when he signed the bill, Calvin Coolidge. People are making the same case today. Their descendants who were barred or who were told that if you're Italian or you're Polish or you're Jewish, that you're not a real American. Their descendants are saying to people of color from Mexico or from El Salvador or Nigeria or Haiti, that you're not a real American. I mean, it's interesting when you know that history. It's just, I shouldn't say interesting, but I don't know of another word to describe it, right? You get yours and then forget everybody, right? And so back to the Brown decision. So there was a series of studies that were done trying to understand why Black people had not assimilated. And those who recognized the existence of Jim Crow as a discrimination stated it's because of Jim Crow. It's holding Black people back. Or I should say, it's literally making their behaviors. It's sort of stunting their behaviors. In the case of Black children, the court found that segregated schools are literally degrading the intelligence levels of Black children. That segregated schools are harmful on Black children. Now, the reason I keep emphasizing Black children, because they didn't say segregated schools are bad for Black and white children. They said segregated schools are bad for Black children. And so now we can understand why, and that segregated schools fundamentally, in other words, Black schools, could never be equal to white schools. And so now we can understand why the court and why racial reformers decided that the best way to heal the educational problem in this country was not to equalize the resources of the schools and then allow everybody to go to any school they wanted, but it was to basically bus Black children to white schools and to integrate white schools. because you can never make a majority black school equal to a majority white school. And so, and why? Because there's something wrong with these people. And so, I'm saying this all because I just want to sort of show the way in which historically racist ideas have prevented even very well-meaning people, well-meaning Americans, people who truly wanted to end the race problem, from seeing what the real essence of the problem has been. And that well-meaning people, particularly within the assimilationist camp, have thought that the problem was both people and policies. And it has therefore led to solutions that have involved people and policy. I should also state very briefly that, and I don't want to really give away the stamp from the beginning, that I thought going into writing this book that the origins of Americans' racist ideas was ignorance innate, and that people who had these racist ideas were the people who were instituting racist policies, who were literally creating structural racism. That's what I thought. Why did I think that? Because that's what I had been taught. And every time somebody says something in this country that you and I consider a racist idea, and we also say that shows that person's ignorance, or that shows that person hates black people, we're regurgitating that idea. And this happens a lot in this town, where for people who are against the president, they constantly say the reason why he says those racist things is because he's ignorant. So they're saying, what we're saying is the source of those racist ideas are ignorance. And we've been saying that for a long time. Slave owners were just ignorant. They didn't know that there's actually no justification for the curse of Ham in the Bible. That it doesn't say anything about black people being the curse of Ham. They're ignorant. We have to teach them the true Bible. Or that people in the South, that those who were instituting those policies that ensured black people could not vote and therefore allowed for people to be put into positions of power that would ensure that black labor remained cheap, that they didn't know that the South was not separate but equal. They didn't know. Or today, people, those politicians in states like Florida or North Carolina, where if we didn't have a felon disenfranchisement law, that they didn't know, they don't know that those states would be blue states. That they're not pushing those laws because they're trying to maintain their power. It's because they ignorantly believe that there's something wrong with black felons or felons more broadly. And so this is what I think we've largely been taught, that ignorance innate leads to racist ideas, and racist ideas lead to racist policies. And in researching STAM from the beginning, this history of racist ideas, and showing the sort of interrelationship between racist ideas and racist policies, I actually found that it was quite the inverse. I actually found that the head of the household was not racist ideas, but racist policies. And I found that historically, out of economic, political, and cultural self-interest, people have instituted or defending racist policies. And then when those policies were challenged, were resisted, or to preempt that resistance, that they or their PR teams produced racist ideas that caused you and I to think that the inequities that were coming out of their policies were not the result of their policies, but were the result of bad people. And then caused you and I to become ignorant in thinking that the problem was those people, or become hateful towards those people. So people consumed those racist ideas and became ignorant and hateful. So I actually very importantly distinguish between the producers of racist ideas and the consumers. And I wanted to study the producers. I wanted to understand their motives. And their motives have been to defend policies that typically benefited them. And so then that causes us to sort of rethink the strategy of undermining that married couple. And it causes us to think, you know what, if ignorance and hate is not the source, then our long-standing strategy to educate and love, our long-standing strategy to educate these powerful producers, to persuade them, to encourage the love within inside them. Now we begin to see why that strategy has failed. And that's not to say it has failed universally. There certainly has been people in positions of power who were unconscious of the way in which their policies were discriminating, and once they were taught, they changed those policies. But generally speaking, people know the effects of their policies. I mean, it's their duty to know. And if they don't know, they're not good leaders. And so it caused us to see, you know what, instead of challenging or educating away ignorance and thinking that's going to reduce the ideas and then that's going to reduce the policies, a more effective strategy has been to challenge policy. That racist policies, if we undermine racist policies, then we can undermine racist ideas. And if we undermine racist ideas, we can undermine ignorance and hate. And so that sort of brings me to why I decided to come to DC, the policy capital of the world, and found the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at AU. Because I realized that I could not continuously go around speaking on STEM from the beginning, talking about how we need to focus on changing policy and support those organizations that are doing so. And I wasn't doing it myself. And, you know, of course, the people were questioning me on that hypocrisy continuously. What are you doing? Thank you. What are you doing to change policy? What are you doing to support organizations that are changing policy, racist policies? And, you know, eventually, you get tired of people sort of bringing to light your own sort of hypocrisy. And fortunately, I didn't have to deal with that long to realize that this book and this research finding, that I had to create something different, an Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center that would be principally focused on investigating racial inequities, specifically the discriminatory policies behind those inequities at a local, national, and international level, disseminating, I should say, innovating new and corrective and practical policies that can undermine those racial inequities that could replace those discriminatory policies, disseminating those innovative policies and even research findings, all leading to campaigns of change that would endeavor to put those policies in place. And so at our center, we are building 6 teams in 6 areas of policy. And those areas are economy, education, environment, health, politics, and justice. And in each of these teams, we aim, once we have the capacity to do so, to bring together a team of scholars, policy experts, journalists, and advocates who will execute that transition from identifying the problem to literally designing a campaign of change to solve it. And we feel that historically, these scholars, these policy experts, these journalists and advocates have been acting in isolation. The scholars investigating the problem, the policy experts innovating policy solutions, the journalists disseminating, and the advocates launching activist sort of campaigns. So we want to bring them together, these critical sort of change agents, and bring them together in these 6 areas. And so that's essentially, it's a lot more sort of involved in that, but that's essentially what we're sort of building to do. Currently, we're in year 0. And so it certainly is going to take a while to build up to 6 teams, to have the fiscal and organizational capacity to do that. But that's what we're building towards. But ultimately, we're founded not just on the idea that there's nothing wrong with groups of people and everything wrong with groups of policies that form structural racism, but we're also founded on a very simple belief that in order to bring about change, you have to believe change is possible. That pessimism, cynicism, is literally the kryptonite of change. And historically, especially those who are very familiar with how deep structural racism runs in this country. And I suspect there's not many people, and I'm not trying to be like conceited, but I suspect there are not that many people who know more about that than me, but I still believe change is possible. Because I know philosophically that we have to believe change is possible in order to dedicate our lives, to dedicate our financial resources, to dedicate our human resources towards that end. And so we're founded on that belief, and we'll be guided on that belief no matter what happens. And I want to encourage you that no matter how bad it gets, you maintain that belief as well. Thank you.
Thank you to United Philanthropy Forum for making the videos possible. With every video, there's a viewing guide and a discussion guide to facilitate your use of this resource. I really want to thank you for being a part of this learning series, for being a part of expanding the table for racial equity. And in the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Thank you.